Let's work through hip flexors together. So I see this a lot. Things are saying your hip flexors are tight because they're weak, or your hip is painful because your hip flexors are weak, so you need to strengthen them. So people are out here strengthening their hip flexors and they're like, that my hip feels worse, and I'm like, yeah, I know. Okay, this might be why. So oftentimes people, oh my gosh, okay, oftentimes people, maybe if they have like an anterior labral tear or they have anterior hip pain or impingement, what we'll see is that the hip actually is sitting like more anterior in the socket. So instead of sinking back nice and deep when we go into these motions, the hip is actually, instead of gliding backwards and like falling closer to me, the hip is like sitting more anterior, and we're getting more like pinching into this area, or we're getting over recruitment of the hip flexors in front of the hip. So if I have a painful hip and I'm loading that motion into hip flexion, yeah, it's going to be sore. So instead, we want to actually load the opposite. Instead, we want to figure out what motions are going to be comfortable for your hip that's actually going to decrease the soreness into the front of your hip for whatever reason it's there. So typically, I'll see that like loading the glutes or even loading the side of the hip is actually able to, instead of going and having that anterior pinching, if we get like really good activation of the glutes with like a squat or even like a side plank, we can have that hip sit relatively more backwards into the socket, so then we're not getting as much compression or pinching into the front of the hip. Once people are looking like really good with squatting or side planks, and that all feels really comfortable and they're having less anterior hip pain, then I'll go ahead and start to load the front of the hip flexors and adductors. But if I start loading them too early into the hip flexors and adductors with like, I'll post a reel after this, but with one of those exercises, they'll typically get more sore and not be able to progress. Takeaway here, yes, your hip flexor is probably weak on your painful side, but we never want to strength train through pain or think that strengthening through pain is going to make the pain go away. Like, that doesn't really sound intuitive. I think there's just such an emphasis on strength training, which is amazing. That I know a lot of people talk to me and they're like, I just know that I need to push through this to get my pain to go away. And you don't want to be in pain when you're strength training. So, I mean, maybe, discomfort because it's hard, but not pain.